It's a great honor to have Prime Minister Mark Carney with us. A few days ago, he won a very big election in Canada, and I think Canada chose a very talented person, a very good person.
Thank you for your hospitality and above all for your leadership. You're a transformational president.
On May 18th, 2026, the United States government did something it has never done in 86 years. It suspended its participation in the Permanent Joint Board on Defense with Canada, a military partnership that was born during World War II when President Franklin Roosevelt and Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King shook hands in Ogdensburg, New York, and promised, "Our two nations will defend this continent together." That handshake lasted 86 years, until now. And the reason why this happened, the real reason, is something most mainstream news outlets are barely scratching the surface on. Stay with me for the next 20 minutes, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand the full chessboard, the F-35 deal, the USMCA deadline, the Davos speech that broke the relationship, the China factor, and what comes next. Let's get into it. First, let's understand what was just suspended, because this is not just some bureaucratic committee. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense, or PJBD, was created in August 1940. The world was at war. Nazi Germany had just conquered France. Britain was being bombed nightly. And the United States, before Pearl Harbor, before it had officially entered the war, sat down with Canada and said, if this continent is threatened, we defend it together. That agreement, signed at Ogdensburg, New York, created a military advisory board that has met twice a year, almost every year, for 86 consecutive years. Through World War II, through the Cold War, through 9/11, through every major geopolitical crisis of the modern era. Senior military officers, diplomats, defense planners, all sitting in the same room coordinating North American defense strategy. And on Monday, May 18th, 2026, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby posted on X, formerly Twitter, and ended it. His exact words, "A strong Canada that prioritizes hard power over rhetoric benefits us all." Unfortunately, Canada has failed to make credible progress on its defense commitments. The Department of War is pausing the Permanent Joint Board on Defense to reassess how this forum benefits shared North American defense. Now, before anyone panics, experts note this does not affect NORAD, the Joint Air Defense Command that guards against missile attacks. Day-to-day military operations between the two countries continue, but the symbolic message is enormous. This is the United States government telling Canada officially and publicly, we don't think this relationship as it currently stands is working for us. And the question is, how did we get here? To understand this moment, you have to go back to January 2026, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, former governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada, stepped up to that podium and delivered what analysts now call the Carney Doctrine. In that speech, he issued a direct call to the world's middle powers, countries like Canada, Germany, Japan, Australia, to band together, to build economic and security alliances that don't depend on the United States or China. His message, barely veiled, was this: the era of relying on Washington is over. Find new partners, build new frameworks. Trump heard it. He was at Davos the same week, and reportedly, Trump made his feelings known instantly. According to multiple reports, he told people on the sidelines, Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. The relationship that had briefly seemed promising. Trump had even called Carney after his election victory and described their call as extremely productive, began to sour fast. Washington later withdrew Canada's invitation to join what Trump called his Board of Peace. Then came the tariffs. 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. Threats to block a new bridge connecting Ontario and Michigan, and now the suspension of the 86-year Defense Board. All roads lead back to that Davos speech. But here's the thing mainstream media gets wrong. This is not just about hurt feelings. This is about a fundamental strategic disagreement over the future of North American security. And the F-35 controversy sits right at the center of it. Here is where it gets really interesting. In 2023, Canada signed a deal to buy 88 Lockheed Martin F-35 fighter jets from the United States. a contract estimated to cost Canadian taxpayers over $73 billion over 45 years. This was meant to replace Canada's aging fleet of F-18s and fulfill its NORAD obligations. Then Trump came back to office and Carney came to power, and suddenly the F-35 deal was under review. Canada's defense minister told the Senate committee in April 2026 that the government was, quote, taking the time needed to examine the fighter fleet question thoroughly. He confirmed that buying jets from non-U.S. manufacturers was still on the table. Options being considered include the French Rafale, the European Eurofighter Typhoon, and the Swedish Saab Gripen. Now, why would Canada even consider walking away from the F-35? Partly politics. After Trump imposed sweeping tariffs and repeatedly humiliated Canadian leadership by calling Carney's predecessor governor instead of prime minister, and by suggesting Canada should become America's 51st state, Canadian politicians needed to show their voters they weren't just rolling over for Washington. But there's a practical concern too. Pentagon insiders have warned that if Canada switches to a European jet, Washington could withhold Link 16, a critical military communication system used by NATO allies. Canada would essentially be left with a plane that can't fully communicate with U.S. and allied forces. Meanwhile, Elbridge Colby's May 18th statement specifically called out Canada's F-35 delays, saying the Canadian government's delays and lack of transparency around its ongoing F-35 review are just one example of the prioritization of politics over shared responsibility for North America's defense. Translation, buy the jets. Or the relationship gets worse. This is classic Trump leverage. And the suspension of the PJBD is the latest chip being played on the table. Now here's the angle that almost no one in the mainstream is connecting properly. While Canada was stepping back from the United States, it was stepping closer to China. After Carney took office in 2025, his government quietly moved to reset relations with Beijing, a sharp reversal from the Trudeau era, when Canada-China ties had been frozen solid over the Huawei executive arrest and allegations of Chinese interference in Canadian elections. Carney's government signed a trade agreement with China on electric vehicles and agriculture, and Trump noticed. He posted on Truth Social, warning that Canada better not become a drop-off port for Chinese goods to enter the United States. Think about what that means strategically. The United States and China are in an intense geopolitical competition. Canada, America's largest trading partner, sharing the world's longest undefended border with the U.S., is making trade deals with China, and then sitting in the North American Defense Partnership. From Washington's perspective, that is a significant security concern. You cannot have a defense partner that is simultaneously deepening economic ties with your primary strategic rival. This is, in large part, why the Pentagon is pulling back from the PJBD. It's not just about NATO spending percentages, it's about trust. And right now, Washington does not fully trust Ottawa. And looming over all of this is a deadline that could reshape the entire North American economic order. July 1st, 2026. That's the USMCA review deadline. The USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA, is the trade agreement that governs nearly $2 trillion in annual trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it requires a formal joint review every 6 years. The problem? The US and Canada couldn't be further apart on what they want. Washington wants to overhaul the deal. Tougher rules on autos, changes to Canada's protected dairy industry, new digital trade provisions. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has already told Congress that a rubber stamp renewal is not in America's national interest. Canada, meanwhile, is drawing red lines. Carney has refused to accept what he calls an unfair deal simply to keep the peace. Here's where it gets dangerous. Article 34.6 of the USMCA allows any country to withdraw from the agreement with just 6 months written notice. If Trump gives that notice before July 3rd, 2026, the withdrawal would be finalized before a new Congress is sworn in, regardless of November midterm results. The U.S. has already launched the review bilaterally with Mexico, leaving Canada out of the room. Carney has responded by forming a new USMCA advisory council of business leaders and former politicians. But critics say this may be too little, too late. The Defense Board suspension is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening on the eve of the most critical trade negotiation in recent Canadian history. Trump is applying maximum pressure on every front simultaneously, and that is a deliberate strategy. So where does this go from here? Let me give you 3 realistic scenarios. Scenario 1, deal gets done. Canada commits to buying the F-35s. Carney presents a credible NATO spending roadmap. Both sides find enough common ground on USMCA to restart the PJBD. Relations stabilize. This is the scenario both governments publicly say they want, and it's still possible. Most experts who analyze the board's suspension describe it as a pressure play, not a permanent divorce. Scenario 2, managed decline. Canada buys some F-35s but also pursues European alternatives. The USMCA review drags past the deadline without a major deal. Canada deepens ties with Europe and expands its China trade. The PJBD stays suspended indefinitely. North American defense planning becomes more complicated and more fragile. This middle path is probably the most likely outcome based on current trajectories. Scenario 3, strategic rupture. Canada formally walks away from the F-35 deal. USMCA collapses or becomes a shell agreement. Canada pivots to a European-led security and trade framework, essentially exiting the American orbit economically and strategically. This would be the most dramatic realignment of North American politics since World War II, and most analysts consider it unlikely in the near term, but no longer unthinkable. What's clear is this: the post-war assumption that Canada and the United States will always work together as natural partners. That assumption is being tested right now in ways it has never been tested before. And the outcome of that test will shape North America for the next generation. Here's what I want you to take away from this video. The suspension of the Permanent Joint Board on Defense is not just a news headline. It is a signal from the most powerful military in the world that the rules of the North American relationship are being renegotiated right now. Whether you think Trump is right or wrong, whether you support Carney or oppose him, the facts on the ground are these. 86 years of military cooperation is paused. A $73 billion jet purchase hangs in the balance. A $2 trillion trade deal faces its first real existential review, and 2 nations that share the world's longest land border are looking at each other with more suspicion than they have in living memory. This story is not over, it's just beginning. If you found this breakdown useful, please share it. Hit the like button, subscribe so you get the next video the moment it drops, and leave me a comment. Do you think this is a temporary pressure campaign, or are we watching a genuine strategic realignment? I want to hear your take. I'll see you in the next one.